In this video we have a look at Filmic in version 5, which came out with Darktable 3.6. So Filmic is a tone mapping module which enables us to map the tones, the luminosities of the scene of the photo to the luminosities of a screen, using two sliders mainly, the white point and the black point. So with those two sliders, Filmic makes a curve, a tone mapping curve. But there are other sliders in other tabs, and I'm thinking of latitude and contrast. And these two sliders I found before this version 5 were very difficult to use because they would have a tendency to break the tone mapping curve. But now there's a new safe option which enables us to use these sliders, contrast and latitude, in a very useful way. And that's what we're going to look at today. And I will also have a quick look at what the colour preservation options are as well. Okay, let's go. Let's start with this picture then, which is a sunset scene, and see how the new Filmic module works. So for the moment, the history is empty. Let's just work with the exposure and switch on the white border. And let's set the middle grey, maybe boost that just a little bit to there. And let's go now into Filmic. I'll remove the white border so we can see better what's happening. Now in this picture we have two areas of interest. The first one is the very dark hill here, which I'd like to bring out a few details in. And the second one, the most problematic area, is probably the sun in the sunset. Let's check if there's any overexposure in the capture. So we have the little overexposure indication here, and this tells me that I have some clipping of the red channel, then red and green, and here in the darker area we have a clipping of all three channels, red, green and blue. So that is problematic because there's absolutely no information in the data captured during the photo. So to start with then, let's set the white exposure. I'll zoom into here just a little bit with the mouse wheel, just so we can see what's happening. And here we have some very pale yellowish colours around the overexposed highlights that I'd like to get rid of. And I can do that by moving up just slightly the white point, so that looks okay now. And zoom out, and I'd like to bring here the black point down to try and recover some of that shadow. I'm not getting much. Let's move that to there. And the first thing we notice now is on the curve of the Filmic module, I have a nice S-curve, which is a bit different to what it was like in the previous versions. Now why is that? Because in the options here on version 5 we have one new option which is used twice in the highlights and in the shadows, which is called safe. Now if I remove that and go back to what we had before we had the choice between soft and hard. Let's go back to soft and see what's happening. So previously, in version 4 and previously, we had to cater with the problem when the curve would turn orange, where it would go underneath 0 here, which is problematic, and sometimes over 100% in the highlights. Now just to remind you what this curve is, the first thing to the starting point is the orange point here, which is 0 EV, the 50% grey, which is 18% relative to the display. That is set with the exposure module, so that's already done. So now in Filmic I can't change this anymore. What's interesting to notice is the 2 points of the latitude. So the lower point here and the higher point here. In between the two we have a straight line. The straight line means that the tones of the image are mapped directly to the display. And the whole point of the Filmic module is to make sure that we have a nice roll off in what is called the toe. The toe is between the 0 and the first point of the latitude, and in the shoulder, which is between the second point of the latitude and the white point. And the whole point is to have a nice smooth curve that doesn't go below 0, and that gives me a nice roll off in the shadows and a nice roll off in the highlights. We did manage to do this in the previous versions, but it'd be a bit more difficult. We'd have to move the white point, let's say, down a little bit. I must say that the maths have changed, so now if you want to use soft, it's a bit more difficult now. I found with the new version 3.6 to get rid of everything. I'm sure something else has changed in the way the maths are done. But the fact of the matter is, if I go into safe here, then the curve becomes now automatically smooth, and it's much more difficult to get underneath 0. So I can actually go back to what I had before, which was about here for the whites and the blacks quite far up. And there I'd have a curve which would stay positive, a nice turning point here in the toe and a nice turn in the shoulder, and that gives me or what is called the filmic look. So that is tone mapping. So you remember tone mapping is the way that the software will adapt. I can show you here. Click 3 times, 4 times. How do you do that? There we are. Got it. So the scene here, which goes between the black point -12 and the white point +3.6 in the scene, and this is tone mapped to the display between 0 and 100. And the latitude is the area where the lines are straight, here vertical, that goes directly from the scene to the display. In the shoulder and the toe we have some compression going on here, which just fits, if you like, all the dark tones of the scene into the display and all the highlights of the scene into the display. So that's exactly what's happening. Now, so that's interesting because this safe module makes the Filmic module easy to use when you're choosing white and black for your picture. Now what I find very interesting, now we have this safe option, is what happens if we go to the Look tab here. Now in the Look tab, this tab was there before, there are 2 sliders, contrast and latitude, which I found difficult to use before, because as soon as I'd touch one of these, then I'd break the curve and it would go into the orange parts, the warnings, where it'd be underneath 0 and above 100. So as a practical use, well, I found it very limited, unless you wanted to remove contrast. But now we have something very interesting, because we can actually add contrast. We can use this slider for the global contrast of the photo. So what happens here when I move the contrast upwards, what it's actually doing is just changing the slope of the straight portion of the curve here in between the 2 points of latitude. The steeper the curve, the more contrast in the scene. So I can basically add a lot of contrast if I like. I don't particularly want that much, but here it's actually useful. Now it's a useful slider. On a side note, something I've noticed has changed in Darktable 3.6 is these sliders are now sticky. So if I click on a slider and stay pressed on the left mouse button, and I was going to show I thought it worked, but it's actually not working here. I've noticed it's better if I move a little bit along. I find it a little bit sticky, and I'd like it to be perfectly sticky. There you see I'm actually below and the slider's still moving, and I'm not actually moving the other sliders. So that's good. That is something I've been waiting for a long time, because I'm not very good at keeping the mouse horizontal. And what happened very often is I'd move a slider while looking at the picture, and notice there what's happened is if I go on the other point, I change. If I go next to the point, no, it's not perfect. It's better. Anyway, that's a side note. So, latitude, let's double click and get these back to where they were. If I can double click them. Double click for 0, double click, get these back. Latitude 33. So contrast, I can move the contrast up and down, change the contrast. Now be warned that the curve here has to stay nice and rounded on the shoulder, on the toe. That is what we're looking for in Filmic. From the moment you put too much constraint on the contrast, and here you have a break in the line, an angle if you like here, then we're actually losing information. We're actually losing the whole use of the Filmic module, which is the nice roll-off. And here we don't have a nice roll-off, we have an angular roll-off. So that is too much. So I can adjust the slider contrast to a point, something I couldn't do before. And the latitude, well, what's the latitude? The latitude gives me the size of the straight line. Now, why would I want the straight line to be bigger? Well, only because of the saturation in the picture. Now, I'll try and explain that. On this graph here, there are actually two curves. This is the tone compressing curve, and underneath we have a saturation curve here. Now, saturation goes from 0 to 100%. Black and white are completely desaturated because black and white don't have any particular colour. In between the 2 points of latitude, the saturation is 100%. And on the shoulder and on the toe, here, these parts here, we have a gradual decrease in saturation, which will give the highlights and the darker tones a natural look to them. So why would I want a bigger latitude? Well, I want a bigger latitude if I want the highlights or the lighter tones to be more saturated. So if you see what's happening, if I move the latitude up, then I have a bigger portion of the image which is at its 100% saturation. 100% saturation doesn't mean I'm adding saturation. It means I'm preserving the initial saturation of the picture. I'm not desaturating. And if I move the latitude down, then I get a nice smoother curve, but I get less saturation in the highlights. So it's all a trade-off. It depends on the image. What I'd be looking for here in the highlights would be some nice colourful yellows in the sky. So I can try and move that up a little bit. I'm not going to gain much on this picture because the dynamic range of the scene was huge. So it seems natural to have difficulties trying to fit all that into the display. But that is how it works anyway. The mid-tone saturation slider was before at 10%. Now it has been set initially to 0 all the time. Here what I'm actually doing is I'm increasing the curve here so it goes over 100, and if it goes over 100 then I'm adding saturation. But the documentation tells us to leave that at 0 and do all saturating and work on colours in the the colour balance, which is now the colour balance RGB module. So this one is just for colour. I'm not going to look into that one for the moment. This video is just for Filmic. So let's keep that like that and keep the mid-tone saturation to 0. Now the shadows highlight balance will move this straight line left or right. So I'm actually moving the points, or up and down if you like, up and down, left and right, which sometimes will help me to even out a curve if I am having trouble finding a nice roll off. I don't often use that. Don't try and edit your photo looking at the curve. Edit the photo by looking at the photo. I think that's the best thing to say about that. So I have something now which is looking okay around the sun. Now this part of the hill is still very dark, but I know the information is there because there's no clipping. So I'd probably do that in the tone equalizer, where the tone equalizer, which is for dodging and burning, and I'd try and lift that up a little bit in the tone equalizer. So I'm sure I can get the details back here. The last thing I'd like to show you for this picture is in the options here. So we can see, go back to the options, we are in V5 of Filmic. Contrast in shadows and highlights is safe, and preserve chrominance. Now what is that? Well, what happens, I read that Filmic will actually, when it's tone mapping the photo, will actually make different adjustments to each of the individual red, green and blue channels. Now we know that if you make individual adjustments to red, green and blue, then the danger is you're going to change the colours of the picture. If you you could add more red to the photo, or add blue, and you would get a colour cast. So the preserve chrominance is there to make sure that we actually keep something of the original colours of the picture. We learn that there's no right way to do this. There are several ways to do it, and if you click on that you can see that there are actually 5 ways to do it, and 1 way to say I don't want to preserve chrominance at all. If I click on no, what happens here is I've got some of these yellow tints in the highlights which look a bit strange. Sometimes it looks okay. There's no real right way to do this. It's just by trial and error. Just have a look, test all the options, see which one's best. What I find is often on yellows, at least bright yellows, luminance is often better. This one is going very orange there. Try and max RGB, so that has taken a lot of colour out of the highlights. The power norm, which is the one that is set by default, works fine, and RGB Euclidean norm, that's bringing in a bit of more colours, so maybe that, maybe this RGB Euclidean norm is not so bad. I'll be able to add saturation, make these colours a bit brighter with a colour balance module, but for the moment what I'm looking for, that doesn't work. The Euclidean norm, the legacy one, doesn't work, so maybe I'll just keep the power norm as it was. Filmic is all about tone mapping. We're not trying to adjust colours, it is just for luminance. And here, from what I see, I'm quite satisfied with the picture as it is here. So I'll leave it at that, and let's have a look at another example. Okay, second example now. This picture here, which is a difficult picture to work on because it was taken at night. These clay pots were filled with oil and all set alight. So it was part of an artistic display, and I thought I'd like to capture this. We do have, obviously here, it was pitch black. It was late at night and very difficult to capture. Let's see, let's toggle the raw overexposure, and it's only to be expected that the centre of all the flames are completely overexposed. So let's try and see what we can do with Filmic on this picture. So first of all, let's set the grey point. So maybe I'm going to lower the exposure a bit on that, get a bit of sense of night time. There we are, the overall exposure of the scene looks okay. I'll toggle that now to switch it off. Let's go into Filmic. So Filmic, by default, contrast in highlights and shadows are safe, which means I can do pretty much what I want in the white white point here, which I'm going to bring up quite far to try and find the natural shape, because that is looking awful. Try and find the natural shape of the flames, and the black point I will move down there to get some darkness back in the picture. So that's looking okay. Now let's go into the look. So contrast and latitude. Contrast. So as I move the contrast up, I'm actually getting some detail. I find more information here in the around the edges of the flames, and I quite like that, so this, as I was saying before, is something I didn't know, well, I couldn't do before, because as soon as I move the contrast up, then the curve would break, and now it's working really, really well, so I'm happy about that, because I can set the global contrast for the scene here and do dodging and burning local contrast with other modules, so the contrast now is here and not anywhere else. Just to show you, there is a contrast slider in the colour balance RGB here which will add contrast as well, but I find that I prefer to do it in Filmic, because for me it's part of the tone mapping. Contrast for me is part of the tone mapping. So latitude, if I move the latitude down, so the shape of the flame is changing a bit there. That is desaturating some of the parts of the photo, and if I move it up, I'm getting a bit more colour. I'm not quite sure where to put that one. Let's put it there. I don't want to touch the balance, middle tones or shadows and highlights. I can try, if you want to just see what that does. Certainly not bring it down, because that is looking awful. If I had a problem with the outer shape with the highlights, then I would move it up. Notice if I move things too far up, you can still break the curve here. Anytime you get orange, the curve is broken. So we have a lot of leeway now with the safe option, but a lot of leeway doesn't give us the possibilities to do anything we like. The module is much more robust. It doesn't mean that you can just move sliders from -100 to 100 and just see what happens. So there, we've got a nice curve on the Filmic. The outside of the flames look okay, behind as well. Let's just see about the colours. Preserve chrominance here. So I'm on power norm, which is fine. Euclidean norm, that breaks the colours, look, because I've got some reds here. Those are completely wrong. Luminance breaks the colours as well. Max RGB is not bad. And no, no thank you. So it's between max RGB and power norm. There's not much difference between the two. I think the power norm is a little bit more colourful, but that one seems to work okay. So you get the hang of it with Filmic now. So the new version 5 gives us the ability to use the options that were already there, but to use them creatively and correctly. So thumbs up to the developers for that one. Let's have a look at one final example. Okay, so I have a picture here of a little spider on a peony flower. This picture was taken with a flash. It's looking very, very dull, very drab. So let's go to the exposure module, and if I want to get the whites back, this flower is white. It was actually white in real life, so the exposure needs moving up. Let's switch that off. Just one thing you need to check. I don't know if it's a bug with my installation, but if I look at input color profile, automatically the working profile goes to Rec 709 and it should be Rec 2020. So you need to check that for your photos. And what is strange is if I reset the parameters, then it goes to Rec 2020. So that's a bit bizarre. So I need to do that every time. I don't know if it's just me or whether it's other people too, but that is something a bit annoying. I have to check all the time. Anyway, that's done. So I am in Linear Rec 2020, which is what I want. So Filmic. What I like to do is keep the whiteness of the flower, but also try and get some nice bright yellows behind, because these pistils here were very, very bright yellow. So let's see that. So the right relative exposure needs to go to the left here, so I'm actually moving it. It's actually going down here, and if I move it down, all the whites get brighter. Maybe that. What I could do is actually click on the automatic here setting and see what it does. No, thank you. Okay, so that's not working as I want it to. The white relative exposure. If I want to check I'm not overexposing, I can clip the use the clipping indication here and try and set the white exposure. There we are, so I don't clip any whites. For the black relative exposure, I'm going to bring this one right up to try and get some contrast back in the picture. There. I will have to add some local dodging and burning, I think, to get this working correctly. But now I have the white point and the black point set. It feels as if it needs more contrast, and maybe let's start with the latitude on this one and see what happens if I move that up. And I'm actually recolouring, I don't know if you can see, I'm recolouring the yellows here. If I move it down, and I'm losing saturation, and if I move it up, I'm recolouring the yellows. So that's, I think for me, is a priority. And maybe try and add a bit of contrast into the picture too, and looking like that. I seem to have got a bit more balance back. The little spider there looks fine. Maybe it will need some local contrast, something sharpening, clarity or something to make it stick out a bit better. But for the moment in its tones, I have all the details, so I'm happy with that. And on the options, here you'll see that in the yellows, as I was saying, these preserve chrominance seem to work really well on yellows. So if I put no, well, I've got some yellows back here, so that's not bad. Max RGB, I seem to have lost the yellow colour there. Luminance Y, I'm getting some, that's not bad. It's a bit more natural than this one. Those yellows are a little bit awful. Luminance Y, the yellows look a bit better. Power norm, no, there's less saturation in the yellows. And Euclidean norm, that's actually not too bad. So it's between Euclidean norm and luminance Y. I have some yellow, I don't know if you can see that. Some of these yellows look a bit strange there. I think on luminance Y I get some smoother tones in the yellows, and that looks good. And I'll be able to boost the saturation later. But there we are, we have one use of Filmic there. So Filmic is not an artistic module. Filmic is there to get a correct exposure, a correct balance in the photo, and I think that's what we've achieved here. Well, there we are for this video. So the new Filmic version 5, much more useful than version 4. Thank you very much to the developers for that. That's a real bonus, having those safe options for the toe and the shoulder. Okay, we'll see you later then for another video.